afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Reimer. It's a pleasure to be joining you today as your host for our second webinar with She, They, Us, and this one is called the Power Hour, which I will explain in a minute. Just so you have a sense of who I am, I was elected to 4 terms in local government in Vancouver, and I now teach about power and policy making and run a consultancy that supports change makers to use their power effectively. So you can tell why I am very excited to dive into our conversation today. But first, we're here today thanks to the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing, a national project focused on ensuring housing policies across Canada include and prioritize women, children, and gender diverse people. To launch this new campaign, She, They, Us, Making Room in Housing. You can see a bit more information about it in the chat, as well as a short bio for Janice Abbott, who's with us this week to give us some more information about the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing. Janice, welcome.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks to everyone who's taken time today to join us for the Power Hour. It's our second webinar in this series. I know our panelists are all bringing lived expertise and hopefully advice to share with us, collected from time spent at City Hall, provincial legislatures, and also in Parliament Hill. We all know how hard it is to be in public life today, and especially for women, and especially for women who are racialized. So I want to start off by thanking Andrea and all of our panelists for all of the ways in which they've put themselves out there in spite of everything, in an effort to make progress for women everywhere. So hands up, huge hands up to everyone. Although we're hosting from Coast Salish territories, we're joined by participants from coast to coast to coast. And in acknowledging the land, I also want to invite everyone to reflect on what we're all prepared to do to give up, what we're all prepared to give up to advance reconciliation across the land. So please give that some thought. I'm thrilled to see longtime friends and co-rebels in this work on this webinar, and all of the new faces too. Thank you everyone for making time. If you're connecting with our work for the first time, the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing is a national project focused on ensuring housing policies across Canada include and prioritize women and children. We host an annual symposium to give women and gender diverse people a space to discuss changes they'd like to see in housing policy at the local, provincial, regional, and national levels. And since our first symposium in 2017, we've encouraged intersectional and inclusive participation. We've successfully facilitated urgent and timely discussions, which have inspired our flagship calls to action. We've also made important recommendations to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which have helped influence the development of the National Housing Strategy. Despite our shared success, there's much more work to do. And so thank you again for being here. Only by working together can we make room in housing policy and funding decisions that meet the needs of women and gender diverse people. So back to you, Andrea, and welcome everyone.
Thank you so much, Janice. So as you heard, today's the second of 4 webinars we're doing over the next month. We've got more things happening with the campaign that I'll explain as we go today. But last Wednesday, we did a reality check on where we're at with housing generally across the country and on the gender-specific crisis that women, children, and gender diverse people face within the national housing crisis, and some thoughts about solutions. I'm very happy to say you can find a recording of that webinar online as of today, and we're just going to get the link posted in the chat. There we go. Today we're calling it the Power Hour, not just because we have 3 powerful folks joining us, but also because we're going to dive into the topic of power and specifically looking at how to navigate power structures effectively to get policy acted on. So just before I tell you more about the powerhouses joining us today, we'd like to know a little bit more about you, all of you listening in today. So I'm just going to have Robin post a Menti in the chat. And that Menti will take you to a poll. And the question in the poll is a word that you associate with power. There we go. One word that you associate with power. Okay, so while you're doing that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who's joining us today. We have Lara Honrado, who is currently the CEO of the Awanu Foundation. She began her career in Washington, D.C. as a reporter covering Capitol Hill. I can already feel the power of Lara. Since then, she's held senior leadership roles in policymaking and public affairs. She's an Action Canada Fellow, a proud member of the Filipinx diaspora, and a recovering extrovert. I love that. Lara and I first worked together when she was Director of Community Relations for Vancouver's longest serving mayor, Gregor Robertson. Okay, we also have Nguyen today, who is the new executive director of Equal Voice, a nonprofit dedicated to electing women to all levels of government. Last year, Chi ran as a candidate herself in the Ontario provincial election. Chi worked for a number of incredible social purpose organizations. We are going to put the list in the chat, but Chi's most important job is being mom to Sam and Ellis. And you don't see them yet because they are currently in the legislature. MPP Kristyn Wong-Tam is going to be joining us in a few minutes. They are the member of provincial parliament for Toronto Centre. They are the Ontario NDP's critic for 2S LGBTQ plus issues and the Attorney General. Before being elected to Queen's Park last year, Kristyn was a city councillor in Toronto and is the founding member of the Church Wellesley Village BIA and the Toronto Biennial of Art. You can probably tell I'm not from Toronto, that it took me, well, yeah, gee, you're gonna have to tell me how to pronounce that when we get to it. The Wellesley was the word that tripped me up the most in all of that. So Lara, I'd love to start with you. You are doing some very cool work right now with your new foundation, but I want to take us back a bit to your time working as Director of Community Relations in the Mayor's office in Vancouver. So in that role, you work to connect a lot of people with City Hall from a lot of very diverse backgrounds. And it was just as the global housing crisis was hitting Canada and landed first on Vancouver's shores. And I mean, that would have been mid-2010s and spread across the country. And I'm guessing a lot of people wanted to talk to you about housing. So I'd love to hear about that experience and what it was like having all these people come to you, asking you to do things about housing that may or may not have been within the power of the city to do.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very excited to be on this panel. Thank you to everyone for organizing it. I'm very excited to be also speaking alongside Chi and hopefully Kristyn, if she can tear herself away from the proceedings at the Ontario Provincial Parliament. So thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to be part of this, really, really important discussion. I can appreciate the challenges that women face around housing in Canada. Living in Vancouver, which is often touted as having one of the best, quality of life in the world, that doesn't really give the full picture of how challenging it is, especially as a woman, especially as a woman single head of household, to have secure, stable, long-term housing in a neighborhood that you feel is a good neighborhood to raise your kids and to be in community. So the topic is very close to my heart. As Andrea mentioned, we first knew each other and started to work closely with each other around 2009 is when I joined the mayor's office in Vancouver. And it was just before the Olympics, where there was so much exuberance for the games and hosting the games. And then at the same time, this parallel thing was happening where people were really, some of the most vulnerable people were displaced and or felt like they were being displaced. Some were actually displaced because of everything that was going on around Vancouver being a host city of the games. So that's when I really started to see what these issues looked like in the community, really from my sort of earliest days working in the mayor's office. In my particular role around community relations, the other thing I will say is, I think my experience through that role is that, sometimes people who are feeling really vulnerable around housing or really around any issues, first of all, with local government, with municipal government, with the mayor's office, that's the level of government that people feel closest to, because it really is, their everyday lives at the neighborhood level, at the city level. The provincial government and the federal government and the people who represent those branches of government, that feels much more distant. Whereas local government really is that. And I think it does really represent that for people. And so I really saw that in my role. The other thing I saw in my role was, not to overgeneralize, but for a lot of communities, it is not really, they would not directly feel comfortable directly speaking to elected officials, especially if there are issues around language barriers, or if it's not within maybe some of the cultural norms. And also for some communities and for some people in general, regardless of community, it is really hard to say that you're struggling and to ask for help. So that is also one of the big barriers there. There's a lot of shame in saying, you know what, I'm having a really hard time and I don't know if I'm going to have housing. I don't know if I can, I'm having a really hard time surviving. That is a really, really tough thing to admit. What I started to see in my role, for me with my community, and it just so happened that I was the only person from my particular community in the mayor's office at that time. So I saw that a lot. People from my community coming to me because there was the ability to communicate in a common language. There was an understanding of cultural norms. There was more of that kind of trust and understanding that could be bridged. And I also saw that a lot across lots of other communities where with those shared languages and with those cultural norms, it was almost like you could describe it as mutual aid, is the way that people would share information, transmit information about how to navigate systems. And those are very strong, but they can be very strong, but they're very informal networks. And so a lot of what is happening within some communities can be invisible to policymakers and people in decision-making roles, because so much of that happens at this kind of community mutual aid level. That was not the case for me, because I was able to see what was going on, at least anecdotally in my community, and able to sort of share that. The last thing that I'll say is, again, around the role of local government and, city councilors or people who are working for municipal government, who are those very direct touch points. A lot of the folks were not, they didn't possess the systems literacy of which level of government did what. And it's not that they didn't have the capacity to understand that. Sometimes it was just a question of, these are folks without stable housing, so they don't have the time to figure out which level of government does what. But really it had to do with, who could they actually communicate with and share with and really talk to, is really what it came down to. And so that was a challenge, in that sometimes I personally felt like I couldn't do enough, or I couldn't do as much as I wanted to. Recently with the new mayor and councilors elected in Vancouver, they made the decision to shut down renter's office, which had not been up and running very long in the city of Vancouver. And, that was a decision that this current Vancouver City Council made. I have to say, I disagreed with that decision, just having known firsthand how much people need that local government touch point to even just help them with the wayfinding to address the specifics of their particular issues. So I think that was a real loss. I hope that maybe other cities may, take up that challenge. And I hope that there are other ways that this current council in Vancouver addresses the housing issue, knowing that they are the level of government that is closest to the people who live here.
Yeah, excellent point. So I'm curious. I mean, I know I teach about power. I could talk about this all day long, and actually do talk about it all day long, many days. I sort of get the sense from what you're saying. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so that's why I wanted to check with you. Like, it sounds like in relation to community members coming in the front door of City Hall, especially those with housing instability, you are in a power position. Like, you may not feel powerful, but there's definitely a power imbalance. And yet, when you go to the province or the federal government, which are often the jurisdictional levels, they're the ones with the money, and many of the policy levels. Do you feel powerful in that equation?
That's a good question. I think for me, that answer is sometimes yes, sometimes less so. And maybe where I have felt the power is in the kind of understanding. So I talked a little bit before about systems literacy, kind of understanding how these systems work and, who has power to make decisions, make changes, make things better, make things worse. But there's also the information and the systems literacy that you understand in being in relationship to community, because you also get to see how those systems aren't working, where the barriers are, really, and not in terms of like a theoretical framework for where those barriers are or where people are experiencing the ability to, the inability to access, safe and stable and secure housing. So in that, I would say I have felt, and I still do feel, that there's a lot of power in understanding both sides of the systems, understanding really how people are experiencing those barriers and where those blocks are from real people and real examples and real community. And then on the other side, understanding where those levers are for change.
Amazing. Okay, well, so Kristyn just arrived. Such a great segue and jumping in point, although unfortunately for Kristyn, they didn't hear what you said. So I will try and summarize or contextualize as much as possible. Welcome, Kristyn. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure. Sorry, I am a little bit late, just dashing from the house, but I am all yours now.
It's all great. We're just really happy that you could fit us into, I'm sure, a very full and also intense day for you with legislature duties. So we were just talking, Lara was talking about their experience working in the City Hall. So, I mean, you have this great breadth of experience at City Hall and in the provincial legislature, but how at City Hall, people, the door is always open. Well, okay, maybe not in the middle of the night, but during the day when people want to talk to you, they can literally walk right in and talk to you. So you have this experience as a city councillor from 2010 to 2022. You saw the housing crisis expand from the lowest income residents all the way through the housing spectrum as this sort of wave of global housing crisis hit Canada. And now you're elected to the provincial legislature. And before you got into politics, you worked in real estate and ran a small business, amongst other things. So I feel like if there was anyone I could ask, who has the power to make a difference on housing?
Well, definitely the federal, provincial governments have a responsibility there. Cities also. I couldn't tell you that it's one entity on its own. It really is a myriad of governments that have to come together to create those solutions. And they can be small or large. They could be simple planning changes. It could be opening up the official plan. It could be investments and money from the federal and provincial government. It could be changes to how the mortgages are structured. It really is a wide range of tools. Obviously, there are some low-hanging fruits. You have to be able to have a government, that's number one, and communities willing to accept housing. If the answer is always no, you can't do this or not in my backyard, that is going to be a problem. So relaxing those very basic planning rules do make a huge difference, but it's not going to produce, so for example, diverse, affordable housing that may create some type of market conditions, but it's not going to create supportive housing, which is really what's needed to address the homelessness crisis in Toronto. There's a whole affordability piece that we are seeing play right out across Ontario, but that will need to have much more specific government interventions.
And so, I mean, you're not in government, you're an opposition MPP, but you have power for sure. Can you talk about the relative power that's just when you walked in? Lara, I was asking about the perception in a conversation at City Hall with people who are housing insecure that you're powerful. You have more power than they have, let's put it that way, in terms of affecting some change on the solution. But then when you look up towards the federal and provincial governments as a city person, you don't feel powerful necessarily. So I'm interested, because you've now gotten a few perspectives on it. How does it feel different trying to help people from your provincial office than it did from the city council office?
That's a great question, and you yourself will know what it's like to lead in municipal government. I think the one major difference that I experience is as someone who is not necessarily on the mayor's team, Sometimes it felt like on opposition benches, even though we didn't necessarily have formal party structures, but definitely I was a progressive urban downtown councillor. And we had a suburban dominated, largely conservative council. So sometimes pushing for progressive policy changes and bylaw changes meant that I had to secure the votes of many more people, which I think is fantastic. It just means that we have to sell the idea across all the political actors. But when it comes to making the big shifts and the big moves, you do need to have the support of the mayor. You do need to have the support of the majority of council. And you're not always going to get that. So with respect to who has the power, obviously for residents who are, feeling very beaten up these days, and let's admit it, the cost of living, the cost of housing, we are in an inflationary position and time in our country where people are really feeling the squeeze, and those individuals are falling through the cracks, and the only people that can help them as they see it is government. And whether or not we're able to change those systems to strengthen our safety net. So, they will look at people like myself who sat in government, municipal government for 12 years and say, why can't you do more? But the reality is oftentimes municipal governments have all the accountability, but none of the responsibility. So for example, when it comes to mental health services, addiction services, all of that comes from provincial and federal purview, but you wear it at the municipal level. You wear it because people see the challenges in daily life as they know it in their communities. Same thing with respect to the lack of deeply affordable housing, which will require some provincial fixes, whether it's supportive housing or creation of more cooperative housing. This can't be built. No city can do this work without the provincial and federal government in hand, and with not just money, but also the political will to sort of shift some of the policies around. So certainly we need to have all those actors coming together, which is why I think citizens are somewhat losing faith in their governments and institutions, because they're asking for solutions and the governments aren't necessarily working together. Not in Ontario anyways. I know BC, you've had some better political times, I believe, than we have, but certainly in Ontario, we're going through a very, very difficult time here.
Yeah, your time right now reminds me of when I was first elected to council. We had Stephen Harper nationally. We had they call themselves liberals, but BC liberals tend to be a little bit more conservative than national liberals. And yeah, it was tough slogging for a city council. We had a mayor very strongly in support of housing and a majority on council, but even at, we didn't have that alignment you're talking about. As we've been talking, Kristyn, I'm thinking, we called today the Power Hour, partially because we have three powerhouses with us, but also because the topic is about who has the power in housing. It's sort of, emerging out of this is that it is important to understand who has the power. It's also important to understand who's being held accountable and who's being made responsible for it, right? And I'm realizing those three questions don't really result in the same answer, which is why the public gets confused about it.
And I think, I think that's a really great point. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, especially if you have other speakers to bring into this one. The only thing I would say to that is that, as a private citizen before I became a public elected official, I never gave up my power. I don't want to give up my power as a citizen, as an active citizen, as a resident of Toronto. And we have organized to great success. So I want people to know that power comes in many different forms, and many people hold different shapes of power. And there's no reason why the citizens, especially the citizens who are organized, who are able to talk to their neighbors, who are able to sort of reach across those who they've never spoken to find commonality on issues that they care about, and to also push their government to be accountable and bring forward solutions. We should never, ever, as people, as citizens, ever give that up.
Perfect. That is an excellent springboard for me to bring Chi in. So Chi, what occurs to me as we've been talking is that even if this was an incredibly easy maze to navigate, two things really stand out. So Kristyn was elected to city council when there was Mayor Rob Ford and then Mayor John Tory. In Vancouver, we had Mayor Robertson. We had premiers Doug Ford and John Horgan and David Eby and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So, there's something in common with all these folks. One is they don't look a lot or anything like any of us on this call today. And they also don't have much experience. I mean, they're not just white men, they're white men who come from a particular class that is not likely to have much direct experience with housing insecurity. So can you tell me a bit about the work that Equal Voices does? Because I think it fits perfectly into this. And how, like, to Kristyn's point, how, if the voices aren't there at the table, how do we bring those voices to these decision makers?
Thanks so much. And I'm really delighted to be in this conversation with some very thoughtful, great, smart women around the table. I've just stepped into the work at Equal Voice, and we're an organization that's been around since 2001 with a mission of getting more women elected to all levels of government. We've initially focused on the federal scene, but are making efforts to focus on municipal, provincial, and federal as well. Some of the work that we do at Equal Voice is about capacity building and making sure that women have a sense of ownership of the political space. We know in our survey work and our research work that lots of women, don't quite know where to start, don't even know where to begin the conversation, and don't have a sense that they can step into the political space. And so we run campaign schools as part of our programming. They're free and available. There's one happening on Sunday night if you are so inclined to hop on. But they're a chance for women to come together and get a sense of what it takes to be political, to engage in campaign life, and to find a community of people to do that with. The thing that we do in the work that's a bit distinct and different is that we work from a multi-partisan perspective, which means that there are people from all parties that support our work. If we're going to get to that goal of getting gender parity in Parliament, we are actually 62nd in the world right now, way down there on the list in terms of our overall federal ranking. I think when I first started following this work, we were like 37th in the world, and we've had a lot of great wins in this space, but wow, there's a lot more to be doing. So when I think about the lived experience that many political folks have, what it takes to run for office, there are a lot of people who do this because they have been close to or have had family members who've been political leaders. We have a lot of political dynasties in the way we operate politics, partly because it's in some ways such an inside baseball game, right? Whether it's winning the nomination and getting to get your name on the ballot, or being able to access the funds and the resourcing to be able to run, there are a number of different barriers that women and gender diverse folks face. And we've certainly seen lots of breakthroughs, but not to the stage where we'd like to be. So for me, this work is really about equipping women and making our legislatures safer places for everyone, more inclusive workplaces, thinking about the kinds of behaviors that can happen in legislatures that can be bullying and toxic and really detrimental. And like, why would you put yourself through that? And it's because you want to show up to make change and serve your communities. So there's a lot of ways in which we're trying to move the needle, but it is certainly not work that we do by ourselves. There are many great players in this space, and we're learning from them constantly.
Wow. So I used to chair the Women's Campaign School nationally before Equal Voice sort of took over that role, which is, it's been great to see it revived and growing again. So I know from my experiences, which were a while back now, 20 years ago with it, of the women who took the campaign school, I would say maybe a quarter of them went on to run, but the other 3/4, I mean, it's not a loss because they became very active members in terms of using their voice in community, different roles that they played, that we also need women strongly speaking in those roles. So is it similar still? You're nodding, so I'm assuming yes, but can you talk a bit about the value of taking it, even if you're not planning on running for office?
Absolutely. I mean, we know in this country that political campaigns are run through volunteer power, and we need more women in campaign back rooms, as campaign managers, as knocking at the doors, helping to raise funds, all of it. There's many ways that people can contribute to building up political movements and building the parties that they feel the most home in. And those parties are often, in some ways can behave in ways where they have a bit of an inside culture and it's hard to really know where to get started. And once you're in, I think it's a lot easier, but that getting your foot in the door and feeling at home there can be a bit of a challenge. And so, and for a lot of women, it's hard to decide which team is the right one for them. And so in some ways, municipal is a great way to start, at least in the Toronto context, because we don't have party affiliations as explicitly. But, I think for us, absolutely, we want women to know all of the parts of the political system because it helps be that bridge, and it may not be right now, but it might be 25 years from now that they think, okay, I'm ready to think about that. And not everyone puts their name on the ballot, but everyone can have a role in making democracy stronger.
Amazing. Well, yeah, so we've talked about how challenging this power landscape is. And the difficulties navigating it. But I want to bring you all in to have a discussion about the power we can control. And that's our own power, right? So Kristyn, you put out that call to action or acknowledgement of the people who've already heard that call. But I'd love to hear stories about where that power where you've seen it used effectively to make change happen. On housing would be a home run, but anywhere would be fantastic. Anyone want to jump in? Kristyn, I saw you unmute, so I might go to you and then over to Chi.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrea. I wanted to just give Equal Voice a plug. In 2010, I actually attended the boot camp. So one of the reasons why I'm in political life is because I was one of the students. I journeyed through the half-day seminar with Equal Voice, which was fantastic. It gave me a sense of, who else was in the room and what was the potential, because I never envisioned myself in elected office. And I think those are the best kind of leaders, the ones who never thought that they would be able to lead. They're the ones who actually are the best leaders. To your point about, who has the power and being able to sort of shift the dialogue, I would say sometimes the losing battles are the ones where the lessons are as well. As an opposition member at Queen's Park in the Ontario legislature, my party and I hopefully will form government in 2026. She will know that we really want to do this. But at the same time, between now and then, there's going to be a lot of battles. There's holding the government's feet to the fire and accountable for bad legislation that may be harmful to Ontarians, but also putting forward ideas, real proposals and solutions that will fix people's everyday problems. And although government bills are guaranteed sure to pass, opposition member bills are not. However, the issues are still worth raising. So I'll just give you one example. Gender affirming healthcare is a bill that I've tabled. I'm hoping to make healthcare system in Ontario more responsive to gender diverse people, making sure that they don't have to languish behind. If healthcare Ontario is broken, can you imagine how broken it is for those who are gender diverse? So we want to be able to do that. And the chances of this bill passing are like next to none. However, I don't care. What matters is that I'm able to speak for the community that has no voice at Queen's Park, and we're able to take the opportunity and raise the profile of the issue so we can create a teaching moment. Would I like it to be passed? Absolutely. Would I want it to be passed with unanimous consent without having to listen to vitriol and hateful transphobic remarks? 100%. Is that realistic? No. But if we don't do it, it means that the trans and gender diverse community who relies on gender affirming healthcare is not going to have their day in the House. So we do it. And so I hope that allows us to build community and build power in community, even if it means that I have to, wait and work harder to get to government so we can pass a bill like that. So I just wanted to highlight that sometimes it's the work in between that helps us build successive steps to power. And power is not necessarily achieved overnight.
Such a good point, that it's not, we have a binary view of the world. And I don't just mean gender, I mean the kind of win-lose thing, right? Like we don't understand a loss as a necessary next step on the way to win the bigger battle.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think sometimes that's why we need more women and gender diverse folks in politics, because they are generally much more collaborative. Like we generally want to get things done. And maybe it's because, we don't oftentimes, occupy spaces of power. So we have to work harder to sort of raise our profile of the issue, make sure that everyone in the room has, an opportunity to be heard, and so that they can also say their mind and share their dissenting opinion, which I think is also good. It only helps us get better if we actually bring everyone together. The world would be a very boring place if we all really agreed with each other all the time.
Yes, although a little bit more agreement feels like we might get some bigger movement, but I hear you. It would be very boring if we agreed. Chi, can I bring you in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking back to some work that I was part of when I was at United Way Toronto. We had a pilot program called Tower Neighborhood Renewal, where we were trying to move the needle on some of the affordable housing that exists in the rental stock. And one of the what felt like a small big win was getting some legislation around zoning change to make sure that what we wanted to see kind of expansion of residential apartment commercial zoning was going to really have an impact on the overall accessibility of some of those apartment buildings. So there are many ways and many partners in these systems, in our systems, whether they're nonprofit partners, whether they're housing providers, that also have an important role in being a connection and connection point to community and being that bridge. And I want governments to have more levers and ways in which they take in that information and use that. We could have democracies that have more robust mechanisms that really have clear feedback loops. And I think that's work that many of us would find really meaningful as, we see our democracies mature and change and shift to actually reflect the needs of diverse communities. And as we have legislators that look more like the communities that they represent, I think we'll get more of that infrastructure inbuilt. But for now, when I think back to your earlier question, Andrea, about, the current political models, like having that lived experience of negotiating childcare and being freaked out about whether or not you're going to make your payments, et cetera. Like those are real things that families are struggling with. And we need the people who make the big decisions and the big public investments in these things to have proximity to that and really understand what that means. And that's one of my wishes for this work, is that we can create better bridges and more of us have trust in participating and contributing and building these systems.
And Lara, I know you've had more than one frontline experience around seeing communities use their voice in ways that were very effective at building power.
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate the comments that Kristyn, Wong-Tam and Chi have shared. I mean, that also gives me a lot of food for thought. And Chi, I'm going to also add that I too went through an equal voice campaign school before I was involved in the mayor's office. So I think you're like at 100% equal voice alumni participation here on this panel, awesome. which is pretty great. I didn't know that was what was going to happen, but that's a nice bonus. One of the examples I'm thinking of, so when the pandemic first hit, which my concept of time is kind of warped through the pandemic, but I want to say that was 3 years ago. I've lost track now of how many years it's been. I was involved in the kind of early days of the City of Vancouver's emergency response to that pandemic. And for me and many others on this kind of smaller team that I had, we knew as soon as the pandemic hit and it was playing out that this pandemic was disproportionately impacting certain groups. And you can kind of, say that that's sort of at the intersection of race and gender, and people who are housing insecure, people who were without housing at all. We knew that was only going to compound all of the inequities that were present before the pandemic. And I have to say that for me anyway, that was sort of quite panic inducing, knowing what was going on as we were all realizing, oh my gosh, this is a global pandemic. This isn't just going to be a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Is there any end in sight? And in that moment and all of the other things that were kind of happening out in the world with a so-called reckoning, what I saw in BC, and granted, we've had a very different political landscape here recently than in Ontario, for example, or other parts of the country. the calls that many communities, many Indigenous folks, many Black folks, many racialized folks have been making for a long time, talking about the need for disaggregated data to inform policymaking, which is just a fancy way of saying, really drilling down and getting accurate information about how, what specific communities were experiencing and how. There was a moment where that call for disaggregated data in the, with the urgency of the pandemic, really seeing how it was playing out, all of that advocacy that had been going on for a number of years kind of accelerated. And as a result, the BC government passed, I think it is called the Anti-Racism Data Act. Andrea or someone correct me if I'm wrong. And that is, I feel like that's a pretty important piece of provincial legislation. It's not going to solve systemic racism, but it is an important step in that direction, in that it now is going to be able to provide policymakers, but also equally and perhaps more importantly, communities, the ability to decide what data is important to them and how they're using and controlling and owning that data and sharing that data, so that it's clear what's happening in their own communities, especially for communities that we know have always been over-policed, over-surveilled, under-resourced, maybe not even visible in terms of the way that we're thinking about these big wicked problems of housing and homelessness, of mental health, of healthcare. So I'm optimistic about that. I'm optimistic about how that can be, that was a community-led effort to make that legislation a reality, and that it is still, I'm optimistic that that will continue to be very much kind of the power with the people to ensure that that data is used in a responsible way, and that is not just collected, but that it is that there is some shared decision making about what that data is, first of all, and what is important to collect, and then how it's used, and that gives all of us a better ability over time to really, make the changes that are needed.
Love it. I mean, we talked earlier, Lara and Kristyn, for your reference, that Lara was talking about systems literacy and the challenge for communities coming into City Hall or your constituency office or Cheese School or wherever it is, and they're like, I want to change everything about housing, so I'm going to run for school board, right? Or whatever it is, because it's just hard to navigate these systems. But Lara, what you're just saying, I mean, some of it's about increasing systems literacy, but a lot of it's about systems change, so that like the systems changing to meet people where they're at in terms of their understandings, and not having to assert information that should be easily collectible through regular routine data collection systems in this case. Kristyn, you and Mike, so I'm going to let you jump in.
I mean, only to support what Laura what Laura said about the need for disaggregated data. And I actually, I really value the fact that BC was leaning so hard to make sure that you had the data to drive, I guess, your work, the programs, how you would spend your money. I think in Toronto, I can share that when I was sitting on the Board of Health, one thing that we struggle with, and I think we continue to struggle with, is that cities generally are not good collectors of disaggregated data. So we don't generally do it. We fall back upon the quality of census data, which is always perpetually 4 years and longer behind. And for a city like Toronto, where everything is changing, month to month, and housing crisis expanded, and population of people coming in because of some type of political unrest in another part of the world, we see them on our doorsteps. So it was really difficult to get to the health inequities, and because we didn't have good, rich data. So we were listening to stories coming from stakeholders and organizations serving those very vulnerable communities that are marginalized, when we were hearing about the disproportionate impacts, but there wasn't really the data to back it up. And what we heard were antidotes. So it really is hard to drive government policy when people are coming to government saying, I feel this, or I've experienced this. And even if you have CEOs and executive directors coming forward and saying, these are the trends that we're observing, this is the demand on our service, it really is still hard to quantify because there's a bunch of very well-meaning bureaucrats at the city that will then start to say, well, where's the proof? And if you can't prove it beyond anecdotes and beyond just, one testimony or another, you can take a picture of a long line for food banks, but it's still somehow not enough. And so governments tend to need that information, and at the same time, they're the one actor that can collect it because they've got their hands in everybody's lives, but they won't do it. And when they do it, they usually collect aggregated data, which doesn't allow us to drill down. So I really want to just applaud BC for going so hard for that.
Nice. Well, while you're unmiked, I had a question for you that follows this vein a bit, Kristyn. There is this challenge. Yeah, I mean, we were talking about binaries earlier and like our colonial binary mindsets of the world. Gender diversity is a huge part of that, right? The idea that even when we are collecting data, if you don't fit in the boxes they give you, it's same for race. Like someone like me who's adopted from a multiracial, my adopted family is multiracial, my birth family is multiracial. I mean, I feel like I'm just checking all the boxes all the time, but not in a good way. So, I mean, how does it, I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on gender diversity and as it relates to feminism and then not men, right? Like how we have that discussion when it comes to anything, but in this case about housing.
And that's I'm so glad you brought up the issue around women and gender diverse people, because that is one of the groups that I would say are oftentimes overlooked. Like we know that women experience poverty differently. The level of violence that women experience because of the lack of housing is so multidimensional. And yet I think Toronto, I can't say this for all of Canada, but my experience at 12 years at City Council, we were almost allergic to the word woman. And I can see she knows this because she knows the work that we were trying to do. And she was a huge part of trying to make the city more women friendly and gender diverse friendly. But it was hella difficult. We can talk about race, we could talk about class, but we couldn't talk about intersectional women's identity. And for whatever reason, it was always this incredible roadblock. I remember doing, I moved a motion to create a gender equality office. I wanted to really be able to put women back on the urban agenda. And even then, such what I thought was simple work that's being modeled and done in other cities around the world. Toronto, the most diverse city in Canada, really struggled on advancing women's issues and a women's perspective on issues. So much so to the point that it's been 12 years I've left government and the work still isn't out. And that's not without, huge Herculean efforts to try. So I think that if women want to be, counted and factored in on decision making, then we're going to have to get ourselves into the boardrooms and into the government halls and make sure that every meeting that we go to, we have a woman there. I hate going into a meeting where like there isn't a single woman or there isn't a person of color. It is horrifying. The other thing I will offer you is that there's this group of racialized people. If we're talking about disaggregated data, then you need to be able to break it down even further. So we're able to sort of very intelligently say we talk about Black people, but Black people are not homogeneous. So we need to talk about where are they coming from and what are their specific needs? Because people from Africa coming to Canada for the first time, and those who are perhaps third generation Caribbean, that's a very different need of Black community members that we have to address. And the same thing for racialized. Like I can't have my East Asian, Chinese, Canadian identity erased just because I'm racialized, and my needs are very different than someone who's from a Cantonese speaker from Hong Kong is very different than someone who may be, Chief's family who's from Vietnam, right? So we're different, and we need to be considered in such ways.
So, question for all of you. I'm realizing we have 10 minutes left. These conversations always go by so quickly. But I would love to know: have you always felt confident? And I'm sort of using confident and powerful as synonyms here. Like, here we are on a webinar talking to Canada about like housing and voice and power. have you always felt confident enough to do that? Or is there a pathway to power, like to finding your own power? And maybe I'll start with you and then go Lara and then over to Kristyn.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question. I would say the kind of like my story around connecting to power came from being in community organizations like St. Stephen's Community House, which is a local neighborhood agency. They had an amazing young women's program, and the young women's program focused on sexual health education and like learning about social issues. And we, as a group, created a magazine and told our stories as young women about being young women and what it was like. That gave me permission to sort of feel like I could talk and say things and observe the world and understand gender dynamics and understand violence in our communities. And it was a gift to get to be part of community programming. We made investments to do that, and it was really powerful to be invited in those ways. And because I had that opportunity to play in that space and to talk about things that were hard to talk about, especially as a young Asian woman, it gave me some comfort and confidence to talk about the things that were important for me. But it wasn't obvious, and it was really hard. And it was when I got skilled up and learned a bunch of things and got knowledgeable and learned from adult allies and mentors that I started to feel like, okay, I have a contribution here, but not just me. Everybody in this room has a contribution here, and we all have a way to contribute to the conversation about the world and the communities we want to build. And so that is where I think we need to remember that invitation, that we can step in and use that power to build the country that we want.
Amazing. Lara, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just I really appreciate everything that she's just shared there, and thinking about what Kristyn was just saying around, wanting to be in rooms where you're not the only, whatever that might be, only woman, only gender diverse person, only racialized person. At the age and stage that I am in at the moment in life, I've been fortunate. I've had opportunities to have a seat at the table, so to speak. Those have been really, really valuable opportunities. They've been isolating when I've been the only at the table. They felt far less isolating when I've had even one other person at the table with me that I feel like I'm not so alone. So I think that's been continually an experience that I reflect on. The kind of role that I'm in now is one that I've never found myself in before, which is it's not about having a seat at the table. The work I'm doing now is exclusively with other women and gender diverse people. And the way that we're approaching it, the way that we all decided to come together, is that we thought, what would it look like if we built our own tables? That is still a journey and a work in progress. It has required, for me personally, unlearning some of the things that were my defaults, and kind of I would say almost like this defensive posture, because I've been so used to being maybe the only woman or the only this or the only that at the table. So I've had to kind of, shed some of those things when I am, metaphorically constructing a table with other women. With other, we use this expression that was coined by a Black woman educator in the UK, people of the global majority. So we talk about ourselves as women and people of the global majority in the work that I do now. And I think, that for me is where it's been wild. It's been an experience that has not just felt, power isn't even the word that I would use, but it has really felt, it has just felt like a much stronger foundation for whatever it is that we set our minds to do. And again, it's a journey, and we're a very new foundation, and we're just getting started. But building our own tables, I think that is where I'm at right now, and that is, I think, where I want to stay for the time being.
Nice. Okay. And Kristyn, your pathway to finding, I don't know, some people are just born confident, right? So I don't want to presume that you weren't born being like, I'm going to be an MPP one day.
Certainly, I was not born confident, although I must say I have to attribute some of my exuberance for getting things done to my mother, who's this remarkable life force. She's 5'0" tall. She has a grade 6 education, but she has the biggest heart of any individual I know. And she always told me that we have to give back. Chi and Lara, like, quite honestly, your stories are so inspiring. There's so much that I've learned just listening to the both of you. Lara, back in 1993, I was part of a group called World Majority Lesbians. And we pretty much decided that, you know what, we are not the minority. We're going to redefine and flip the table. So the fact that you want to build your own table, I love it. Absolutely love it. And my story is actually somewhat similar to yours in terms of building power through community advocacy and work. At age 16, I came out of the closet, walked into a community center called the 519 in Toronto, which is sort of the lesbian and gay community center here in our big city. And I found my political voice. I also found my political family, our chosen family, if I can call it that. But really, it had everything to do with finding people who share similar values or perhaps similar cultural identity characteristics, and then building from there. I didn't know what about the world I wanted to change. I really didn't. I was way too young. I was not as smart as the 16-year-olds these days. We weren't all plugged in. But I knew that the status quo was not good. What I also knew is that there were people who were being left behind, and that really angered me. And it was this combination of equal portions of love and anger that just drove me forward. So I would say that's probably where I find my quote unquote power from.
Cool. All right. Well, so we're, once again, we are almost at the end. This happened last week too, where I'm like, I have 20 more questions that are in my head, but we're not going to get to them. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about my last question to each of you while I give some information. And it is, if you could change one thing in people's minds about power, what would it be? So a fairly brief comment on that. Just as you're thinking about that, for all of you listening in today, the Menti was just posted in the chat. And the question for all of you is a new word that is in your head around power. We did not get to one of the questions about the role of protest, but I'm actually kind of excited about asking that in next week's webinar to our guests. We're going to have former Mayor of Toronto, David Miller, Rami Bowers, who's the CEO of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, and Grace Lohr, MLA and Minister of State in the BC Provincial Legislature. And we're going to be talking about voice with them. And they just posted the link in the chat for you to sign up. So Chi, Lara, Kristyn, what would you like to tell people to change their minds about power? If you could tell them one thing.
Do you want me to kick it off?
Sure, that's great. Thank you.
I sit at the provincial legislature, and I can tell you that power is to be taken. You have to come and get it. Like these guys are not going to give it up. I tell you, without you going to grab it. And I don't mean in violent ways. Like I mean, by going to the voting stations, by organizing your communities, by making sure that you're able to sort of flip the script. That's what I can say about power. It's ours for taking, and it doesn't belong to the fat rich cats. It doesn't. There's way more of us than there are of them.
Amazing. Okay, maybe we'll go Chi next and finish off with Lara.
I'll keep it short. That it's ours. It belongs to all of us, and that means the very organized soccer moms who make sure that practices happen in a particular way. That means like people organizing mutual aid. It means people who don't have status. We all have a level of power that we can exercise, and it can be formally and informally, but our work is to make those political institutions look more like us, because that is how we deepen democracy in this country.
Amazing. Okay, Lara.
I have to agree with both Chi and Kristyn. I mean, what I think the quote, I may be misquoting, but power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. So I absolutely agree with that. And I think that also, groups who don't have power actually understand power deeply, or who are on the margins of power have actually the most in-depth understanding of how power works. Which means that, for any of us who has ever been felt that way or been in those circumstances, it's that understanding of how power really works where there is the kind of nascent power that can come to the surface. And sometimes I think the people who have the power and feel like they're entitled to it can be a little bit on autopilot and probably miss a lot of things that people on the margins know to be true. And I think that makes for a lot of power as well.
Amazing. Chi, Lara, Kristyn, I can't thank you enough, not just for the hour you've given us today, but for everything you're doing to make room for women and gender diverse people in housing. Everyone listening in, there's a last mentee for you, just to leave you with, if there's ways, I mean, as you've heard, the pathway for all three people on this call today, and I would add myself to that, into using our voices was someone invited us. So we will on Friday, we're opening up a very special opportunity for women and gender diverse people who have the lived expertise of the housing crisis. We're inviting them into some training sessions that'll be happening from March 11th to April 1st. We'll be teaching about power literacy, we'll be teaching about voice, we'll be teaching about organizing, and we would love for you to be that person who extends a hand to people that you know who are in those positions, and inviting them in so that we can support them in finding their voice. Thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the day, and hopefully we'll see those of you watching next Wednesday.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrea. Nice
Thanks,
seeing you
everyone.
all.
Nice to see you
Thank
too.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.